New evidence has emerged. This is something obviously we've been suspicious of on Tyskie Sour for a very long time, that these scientists who are employed by the government tend to be more than willing to cover for them, and to often cover for them in a very unscientific way. This was evident in SAGE advice newly released yesterday, which showed the scientists said things in private which contradicted what they said publicly. It was also apparent in evidence given by the Chief Scientific Officer Patrick Valence and the Deputy Chief Medical Officer Jenny Harris to the Health and Social Care Select Committee yesterday. I want to take a look at a couple of those key examples. So the first is from the newly published SAGE minutes. This was on the 3rd of March. SAGE met to discuss the use of behavioural and social interventions on a COVID-19 epidemic in the UK. A very interesting document in general, but what's particularly interesting is this particular paragraph. So it says, there was agreement that government should advise against greetings such as shaking hands and hugging, giving existing evidence about the importance of hand hygiene. A public message against shaking hands has additional value as a signal about the importance of hand hygiene. Now, that was on March the 3rd, and we know that SAGE meetings are chaired by Patrick Valence or Chris Witty, so the Chief Scientific Advisor or the Chief Medical Officer, mostly both of them. Now, on that same day, so on March the 3rd, this is what was said in a government press conference with Boris Johnson flanked by Chris Witty and Patrick Valence.
Well, Victoria, I can tell you that I'm shaking hands continuously. I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody. You'll be pleased to know, and I continue to shake hands. And I think it's very important that we, people obviously can make up their own minds. I think that Matt has said that people must make up their own minds, but I think the scientific evidence is, well, I'll hand over to the experts. But our judgment is wash. Washing your hands is the crucial thing.
One, Boris Johnson, completely stupid. I was shaking hands with people with coronavirus. But then the journalist, or actually it was Boris Johnson, explicitly passes on that question to Patrick Valence, who we know sat in a meeting that day where the minutes from that meeting, so what was agreed by all of the scientists there as official advice was to tell people to stop shaking hands. He stood there, sort of shrugged his shoulder and said, just shake your hands. So he was directly contradicting what was agreed that day by scientists. Why? To cover for Boris Johnson. And we were supposed to believe that these were the scientists who were leading government. No, it was clearly the other way around. There's another example. So this is from the Health and Social Care Committee yesterday. And this is not Patrick Valence, this is Jenny Harris. So she is the Deputy Chief Medical Officer for the UK. She was asked yesterday by Jeremy Hunt, who was a terrible health secretary, but is actually quite good at being chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee. She was asked about the UK's decision to stop community testing back in March. This is what she said.
The issue here is what capacity do we have to undertake testing, and where should that be prioritised? So in the unlikely event that a country has unending capacity to test, then I think we would continue. However, there is an issue around capacity, and it's not just the testing. I think, unfortunately, some of the conversations have ended with perhaps just thinking about the testing. It's the action that goes with it.
Jenny Harris there saying what we always suspected all along, which was the reason that the government stopped community testing was because the government didn't have capacity to do community testing at that point. It was an issue of capacity. That's a reasonable answer. The problem is what Jenny Harris said there when she was under scrutiny from MPs is in direct contradiction to what she said on March 26 when she was explaining government policies to the press and the public. So on March 26 at a press conference, she was asked why Britain had gone against WHO advice and stopped mass community testing. A similar question to that asked by Jeremy Hunt. Let's take a look.
But there comes a point in a pandemic where that is not an appropriate intervention, and that is the point really where we moved into delay, and although we still do some contact tracing and testing, for example in high-risk areas like prisons or care homes, that is not an appropriate mechanism as we go forward.
So that was Jenny Harris saying the reason we're stopping community testing is because it's not medically appropriate. It's a matter of epidemiology. She's not saying it's a matter of capacity. She's saying one thing to the public, another thing under scrutiny from MPs, just like Patrick Valence is saying one thing in a SAGE meeting and saying another thing to the press and the public. I mean, Aaron, this completely undermines the claim that the government have been making, that they have been led by the science. And to me, I mean, me watching these, when there is an inquiry, or I mean, when there is investigative journalism into it right now, this really doesn't make these scientists look very good, does it?
Well, Jenny Harries in particular, I mean, I remember when we were commenting on that second clip we just played towards the end of March, and she said, well, WHO guidance comes from the World Health Organization. The clue is in the name, world. You have different healthcare systems, and you think, what? You know, a viral pandemic, you have the transmission of a virus. It's human to human, doesn't really matter what society you're in. The presumption was that the NHS would have such capacity that it could basically take this on. But that appears just to have been an article of faith. There doesn't seem to have been any science behind it. The preparations were there for something equivalent to a seasonal flu. And even when Jenny Harries there is talking in late March, it's as if she thinks we're going to have a seasonal flu, that we weren't dealing with something with a far higher level of mortality. We weren't dealing with something which is actually in many ways far more contagious because it's asymptomatic and so on. It's strange. It's kind of like they were in this psychological denial of just the extent of this problem for weeks, really, until the government has its first coronavirus action plan on March the 3rd. But I don't think it's until the end of March that actually we get moving. And when you think that, you know, the Americans were putting in bids, we now know this. Panorama did a great piece of journalism on this. The Americans were putting in bids for PPE from British firms. Please ramp up production. We're going to import it from you. And yet our domestic senior science advisors are still behaving like it's really just a flu epidemic 6 weeks, 8 weeks later. You don't want to obviously attack individuals in this context, but Jenny Harries in particular seems very remiss in her duties. And again, I think it's right to say, look, this is not about a few bad apples or bad people or people who are incapable scientists. I think you're entirely right, Michael. The way these incentives stack up, if you want to be a science advisor for government, you have to toe a particular line. There are a certain set of parameters you can't step outside of. I don't think that's a good way to operate in a society where we want good, objective, scientific advice given to politicians so that they can act in full receipt of the facts and an objective analysis of what's going on rather than what they want to hear. And increasingly, it sounds like, and this is a generous reading, by the way, it sounds like they are being told what they want to hear. Of course, there's another layer to this. We know to an extent that Dominic Cummings and other people close to Boris Johnson were in at those meetings. We could infer that perhaps there were other real-time conversations happening between the science advisors and Dominic Cummings. Again, incentives really all over the place. Dominic Cummings' job is to make sure Boris Johnson gets re-elected. The job of senior government science advisors is to offer objective scientific analysis and advice. You have different incentives. Please, please, please. You shouldn't have one of these guys telling one of these guys, i.e. Dominic Cummings telling Jenny Harries or Chris Witty what they should or shouldn't be doing, or what advice is or isn't wise. Very, very, very dangerous. And again, one for any future inquiry or investigation.
And I mean, I think the real issue here is you can't have your cake and eat it. So it could be the case that the job of scientists employed by the government is one to, sort of advise them in private and then in public go out and bat for them to the hilt. Yep. That is what some employees are supposed to do, and that would be a legitimate job. But that is completely in contradiction to the job of being an independent authority, which we are supposed to, defer to. And so there was a complete category error made by the mainstream media during this period, which was to suggest that these were independent scientific authorities when actually they were employees of the government behaving like employees of the government, perfectly willing to cover for them. And it seems, quite frankly, to lie to do so.